So this video lecture is going to talk about Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education, which starts on page 1640, and T.N. Mukharji's The Indian and Colonial Exhibition, which starts on 1656. So this video lecture is going to explore our two sort of shorter readings about British colonial India, or sort of connections between India and the British. So let's start with Macaulay. So Macaulay is an interesting chap. He is a significantly influential and important figure in early Victorian politics and ideology, and he was a member of the Supreme Council of the British East India Company, and so what we have here is a section of his Minute on Indian Education in which he's talking about the company setting up, and to be clear, the British East India Company controlled India. It was a private corporation or a joint stock company that controlled India basically up until 1857, when there was an uprising when a group of sepoys, who were Indian soldiers fighting for the British, rebelled for independence, and then the British Crown took control of India. So Macaulay is writing this for basically a private corporation that controls India, and they're setting up an educational infrastructure, which is one of the things that the British do, which has both positive and negative consequences, and we'll talk more about that for those of you who pursue the post-colonial reading list in the 20th century. But Macaulay is setting up here, or is trying to set up here, an education system, and essentially what he's arguing is that it is of more value to teach an Indian upper class, an Indian sort of bourgeoisie, middle class, upper class, to teach them English language and literature is more valuable than teaching them Sanskrit or Persian. He calls it Arabic, but it would actually be Persian, would be the other sort of major written language in India at the time. And the reason that he argues this, he says here on 1641, it will hardly be disputed, I suppose, that the department of literature in which the Eastern writers stand highest is poetry, and I certainly never met with any Orientalist who ventured to maintain that the Arabic and Sanskrit poetry could be compared to that of the great European nations. But when we pass from works of imagination to works in which facts are recorded and general principles investigated, the superiority of the Europeans becomes absolutely immeasurable. So what Macaulay is doing here is setting up a specific set of criteria and a specific set of genres in which he claims European writers are absolutely superior to Indian writers. Part of the problem with this is that the distinction Macaulay is making is a culturally constructed distinction. So this distinction between works of imagination and what he calls works in which facts are recorded and general principles investigated, this is a distinction that's not absolute and not self-evident in the way that Macaulay treats it. Now, at the time, in the Victorian era, this is a distinction that would have been readily accepted. Today, we have a somewhat more sophisticated sense of how cultures affect what are perceived as norms. And so what Macaulay is presenting here, this distinction, is actually a distinction created by European culture that doesn't necessarily register meaning in Indian culture, or in Indian literature. So things like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, these sort of great works of Indian literature, great sort of philosophies, great writers like Rumi and things like this, there's not necessarily the absolute distinction between mythology and fact, or mythology and history, or literature and fact that Macaulay would like there to be. There is, in fact, sort of multiple purposes to these literary works, including the conveyance of philosophy, history, natural science, understandings of the world, and things like this that happen to differ from the way that the English think of them. Which does not mean that they're wrong or inferior, it just means that they're different. And Macaulay is not sort of at a cultural point where he can appreciate that difference. But okay, so we get this goal stated. So on the one hand, Macaulay wants to teach Indians English, he wants to teach them the English language, English literature, and so on and so on. And on 1642, he gives us the reason for this. This is part of a program. In the program, the goal of the program is, he says here, to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. And this is a significant point. I talk about this in the lecture notes for this reading. There's a fellow named Homi Bhabha, who's incredibly influential and important post-colonial theorist, and he gives us this theory of the Mimic Man. And basically the idea is that the Mimic Man, the Colonial Mimic Man, is someone who is trained to be English in, we'll say English for the sake of it, but it could be English, French, German, Dutch, whatever it is. Someone who's trained to be English, but can never fully be English because their ethnicity, their skin color, their appearance, whatever it is. So it's this sort of betwixt and between figure who is not fully Indian because he's trained to be, and this is almost always conceptualized as a male figure because of sort of limitations on women's education at this period, especially in the colonies. But this is a figure who is culturally English, but is ethnically Indian. And so he's neither fully English because of his ethnicity, nor fully Indian because of his culture. And we get that figure sort of in T.N. Mukharji, but Mukharji isn't and actually, I take it back, Mukharji is actually an excellent example of the Colonial Mimic Man. Not in necessarily his sense of displacement, his sense of betwixt and betweenment, but in the way that he turns British expectations of India and Indian sort of understandings of themselves as colonized subjects, he turns these on their head in really interesting ways. And Mukharji is actually really funny. Like, the way that he presents himself as this sort of trickster figure getting a one-up on the British is really fascinating. And that that trickster figure, that storyline, is a key component of colonial mimicry. But we can take this bit in 1656, very early in the narrative, where he says, this is at the Indian and Colonial Exhibition, when they're sort of being observed creepily. It's like a zoo, almost. The way that they're being observed at this exhibition. And he says, the number of wives we left behind at home was a constant theme of speculation among them, and shrewd guesses were sometimes made on this point, 250 being a favorite number. And he tells this story of one of his compatriots who has a bit of fun with one of the British girls, because he asks her to be his 40th wife, who had died before he came to Britain. And so there's this whole story where they're sort of playing into this supposition that India, or that the East, is exotic, is sensual, is eroticized. And they're playing into this in a very sort of self-conscious way, because the reality is that while both Hinduism and Islam, which are the two dominant religions in India at this time, both of them allow for polygamy, but it's not, so first off, they both have sort of limitations or guidelines specifying a fairly small number of wives for most people. There are some exceptions where people have just sort of built harems of thousands or whatever it is, but these are extremely rare instances. And there's a lot of dispute about how widely polygamy was practiced at all in India. And some people arguing that it was almost non-existent in practice, particularly under British rule, because it was not a practice that the British believed in. But I mean, so Mukharji is doing this continuously throughout the narrative, sort of having fun at the expense of the English who are coming to see him, or who are seeing him in sort of random cafes and things. And he actually says on 1658, this is what he's doing. He says, "I thought I might do worse than having a little fun, if any could be made out of the notice that was being taken of me." And so we've got this sense that Mukharji knows the British better than they know themselves, because he can see them from outside. He can see the way that they conceptualize India and the way they conceptualize the empire in general. But of course, India and Mukharji's narrative tells us interesting things about British India as well, because again, on the one hand, we've got this 250 wives, exotic, erotic, sensual, foreign East, sort of eroticized, sensual space of India. On the other hand, we've got Mukharji blending fairly seamlessly into a British aristocracy, because he himself is a Brahmin, which is the highest caste in Hindu society. And he says, 1657, he says this very directly, "Gentlemen and ladies of high education and culture, however, honored us as the representatives of the most ancient nation now existing on the face of the earth. They would frequently ask us home, get up private parties, and arrange for all sorts of amusements." So, on the one hand, there's exotic India. On the other hand, there is ancient, dignified, and sophisticated India. And these two cultural images coexist, and while they're somewhat separate by social class, or it tends to be the educated, wealthy aristocracy who views India as ancient and sophisticated, and the poor, common, working class people who view it as exotic, there's overlap there. So India is both in the British imagination, and it's both and neither of those things in practice and in the experience of Indians.